righty, it is May 21st. Time kind of is flying a little bit. I saw someone bemoaning the fact that it was like the 87th day of March the other day. And I was like, I don't know about that, man. I kind of feel like time is flying. We've got some fun stuff coming up on the forecast today. We're going to talk to Jason Fitzgerald from OverTheCap. And he's got a bunch of stuff that he's been working on this offseason. We're talking to him about contracts in general, the salary cap, and then a little Dak and Mahomes as well. And before that, we're going to do kind of a little preamble to it about, what should you pay quarterbacks? When should you pay them? Just start that discussion. So it should be fun. And then at the end, we're going to talk about the match, which is something that's live sports that we get to bet on. And it includes football players. So it'll be perfect. So with that being said, let's rock.
George, I wasn't prepared for this match discussion. Now I have to go and do my my 5-minute handicap here.
It was purposeful. I want a just off the cuff, because here's the thing. Here's what I realized about this, and we'll get to it at the end after Jason leaves. But people are there's not going to be a whole lot of analysis that you can do, and people are going to probably try and do a decent amount. But it's just something fun to talk about. Honestly, who cares? It's just, I'm just excited to see a couple players that, one that I haven't seen in a while, and Peyton Manning, do something other than detail, and then a couple of great golfers. So that'll be fun.
It's a great, and we had a discussion, what was it, Monday after the pod, about Woods and, Brady and Michael Jordan, that I thought was kind of interesting. It's funny because I wasn't confident enough in my viewpoint to sort of say it on the pod, I guess. But I feel like I did converge to something, right? Which is that, maybe Tiger might be the closest thing to MJ, but he's still not close.
Yeah. Yeah. And also I thought we hit on something. So that the first point you made is exactly it. But the second one that I came up with is that football is such a different sport, right? It's so hard to have that humongous, kind of sway over everything because of how many different players and how many different coaches there are. And Tom Brady, who I think is going to come up in this quarterback discussion a lot, because everyone has said, well, he's, been underpaid for so long, is he the greatest of all time? Yeah, okay, well, it's him and it's Montana, but none of those guys are playing defense, right? And that's a huge component of the game that they just can't have as big of an impact over. It's super interesting.
Well, isn't this the situation we're talking about, the simulation and stuff, and the football is an inherently random game that the quarterback controls more than anybody, but doesn't control as much as you said, a basketball player who's 1/10 of the players on the court and plays both sides of the ball in an 82 game season consisting of, I got to think about 100, let's say ballpark, 100 scoring plays in a game. So if you're the best, right, the fact that you're the best, the confidence intervals are going to be so narrow, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas in quarterback play, and that's why the Patriots deserve so much credit, because you look at some of the dynasties historically, there was a year in the Niners dynasty with Montana that they didn't even make the playoffs, even though they were 10-6 or something. They randomly didn't make it in. They were a Roger Craig fumble away from making 3 straight Super Bowls. And there's just so much noise associated with that. Whereas with the Bulls, it was basketball is the type of game that, the churn is so high. And so, you get the confidence intervals, narrowing in that game. I don't know enough about golf to know if that's true about Woods. But it is more individual. He's basically the only person that influences his, maybe other than, his social life and things like that. But he's the only one that influences his outcomes. Is golf on the noisy side like football, or maybe on the more deterministic side like basketball, is really the question, and maybe why we see such a difference in Jordan versus everybody else, specifically Tiger Woods.
Yeah, he has I play on a team, but also it's a team that's small enough where one person can have that big of an impact. Whereas, in golf, it's who cares if you're a tyrant? Like you don't have any teammates
Yeah.
that you need to worry about. I mean, so it's very interesting. Let's talk before Jason hops on here. He's coming on in about 10 minutes about the concept of paying quarterbacks. We're going to talk to him about Dak and Mahomes. And the question is, should I pay this guy all the money in the world? Should I give this guy a second contract? Or should I just be trying to churn and burn? Should I be saying, look, I'm going to keep this guy for 5 years, but then after that, I'm going to retool. I'm going to try and find another young guy, and I'm just going to keep doing that ad nauseum. And maybe the real answer is somewhere in the middle. I think that's where I'd land. What are, like, right now, what has the evolution been of your understanding in this respect?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so last year we wrote an article, about Dak and how he shouldn't be given the max deal. And then Dak goes out and produces the second most valuable season in the league during the regular season. And so it's like, what do we do here? We've seen, the Rams were, quite good when Goff was on a rookie deal. And the first year that he's on an expensive deal, they go 9-7, they miss the playoffs, and it doesn't even look like it's getting much better for them. So the question then becomes is like, okay, is there a situation in which paying a quarterback top dollar is worth it? And we found, Russell Wilson is the one that we were sort of thinking about. And now the Seahawks aren't exactly a Super Bowl contender. They're a playoff contender, and they do really well. But what does Russell Wilson do? Russell Wilson sort of enhances those around him, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're paying the quarterback that kind of money, you kind of have to be at peace with him, either A, making up for a bad defense, which, you can't put money into, or elevating, and I think this is the case in Wilson's situation, elevating the receivers around him, many of whom might not be getting the highest salary, elevating an offensive line around him, many of whom might not be getting the highest salary. To me, that's kind of, I think, where the discussion is. If he's a quarterback that elevates the play of those around him, I think he's worth it. If he's not, then it's kind of a churn and burn situation. So the question is Dak that player?
Yeah. Okay. So let me play a little devil's advocate here, which would be that Jared Goff. So Jared Goff is a really interesting one because we talked about him last year and we said, hey, where does he fall on this list? And to me, he fell in he's not good enough for me to dedicate all of this resource to. But you also have to look at it from what are the other resources you're dedicating. And the way I think of it, and I'm like, okay, yeah, you can overpay this guy and he needs a good supporting cast to succeed. But you also need to understand what that supporting cast is. It's not like you're paying Jared Goff, 40% of the cap. Like, the cap is huge. And I was looking at it today and I was like, the real problem is that you shouldn't be paying, and I'm just going to use Khalil Mack as an example because it'll make people mad, but like, you shouldn't be paying Khalil Mack $22 million. Like, if you just think about the other places where you're not getting bang for your buck, it makes it way easier to overpay quarterbacks a little bit, but you're still getting more from the quarterback than you are from the other positions. That's kind of the point that I'm trying to make is like, It's not just the quarterback that matters. It's how you distribute the rest of your funding.
100%. I mean, and we look, and again, this is like what the question is a little bit deeper, right, than QB. Mm-hmm. It's how does QB have a knock-on effect of the rest of the players?
Sure.
Wide receiver. So if Dak Prescott's a terrific quarterback, he's going to make CeeDee Lamb on a rookie contract great, right? Mm-hmm. He's going to make he's going to make Michael Gallup on his rookie contract great. And he's going to give Amari Cooper a fighting chance of being worth $20 million a year, right? Yep. That's kind of how you have to look at it. One of the things we've been doing is kind of looking at clusters of positions. So if you look at, let's say, quarterback, wide receiver, tight end, O-line, and look at how many like wins per dollar you get there are some interesting teams that pop up that still pay their quarterback a lot. Take, for example, New Orleans. What does Drew Brees do that makes him great?
he turns Michael Thomas into, and now Michael Thomas is great,
Yep.
but Michael Thomas is being talked about as, is this going to be the greatest receiver of all time? Alvin Kamara had what if I remember correctly, the most valuable running back season that we've ever seen from a WAR perspective.
Correct.
And like those things are, it's exactly what I'm talking about, right? So if you say, look, I know that this quarterback is going to have this downstream effect on my offense. I'm going to invest in my offense, but I'm going to do so intelligently. And then on the defensive side of the ball, this is where I keep getting back to the thing that you wrote about a couple months ago, which is understanding the connectedness of defense and leveraging that to your benefit can save you a ton of money so that you're not investing in these hugely high priced singular defensive players. So I was on your buddy Soren's show yesterday evening. And by the way, if you are a Chiefs fan, if you enjoy listening to like talk radio, if that's your thing, Soren Petro is awesome. That
He's
guy
really good at it.
You could talk football. We talked about basketball for a lot of the show yesterday. I mean, he knows a ton, but he, was mentioning the whole like Frank Clark thing. And I was like, that is a great example of when you look back on this 5 years from now and you go, what was really going to generate value for the Kansas City Chiefs? Frank Clark is going to be way down the list, but when you look at what you're paying him, he's going to be way up the list, and that's what you have to avoid.
Yeah. The Chiefs were the 6th worst team in the NFL last year in terms of WAR per dollar on the defensive line,
Right.
And so that, like, to finish the discussion of Breeze, right? Breeze makes his offensive line better, right? Brady makes his offensive line better. So there are 5 guys on your offense. That's 5/11ths of your offense that you need to play well, that your quarterback manufactures solid play out of, and hence you don't have to dump money into that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, to me, right, and Michael Thomas, the Saints last season had 0 wide receivers besides Michael Thomas who caught passes for more than 500 yards. And they were still 13-3, right? And then granted, their defense is pretty good. But, I always think about, like, back in the day, like Packers when they had Aaron Rodgers and their defense was horrendous personnel-wise. But they keep it together, and then Rodgers would get hurt, and then they all of a sudden be like, what's wrong with the defense? Well, it's like, well, your defense can play aggressively when they know that their quarterback is going to score and match every score that the other team has, right? Mm-hmm. You have to play timidly if you don't think that your offense can produce 17 points in a game, right? Every mistake you make is magnified. The quarterback has this knockdown effect on every single position group, and that's why, like, that's how you got to look at it, right? So the question becomes like, okay, if I'm Dallas and I look at Dak, is my defense playing balls to the wall because they know, hey, if I give up an 80-yard touchdown over the top, Dak's got my back, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are they playing? Is the offensive line? Are you allowed, like when Travis Frederick retires, right? Are you saying to yourself, well, we got to go out and get an absolute hoss to play center, and we got to pay him for it? Or do you say to yourself, well, no, he's in his 5th year now. He's going to figure out protections, and we can put Austin Ryder in there in the case of Kansas City. I think all those things are true about Mahomes. I think all those things are true about Russell Wilson. They were true about Brady, Breeze, right? All the quarterbacks that we think of as being elite,
sure,
like that's where the hidden thing is. Dak is a question mark. I'm not sure. Like, I think Dak's great. Yeah.
Because here's the one that I want to look at is San Francisco and Minnesota, who, if you look at the clustering of their receivers, their tight ends, and their offensive line, and their running backs with the quarterback, they're a team that went to the Super Bowl last year, but their WAR per dollar on the offensive side was actually lower than the Patriots. And I'm not going to sit here and argue, as much as I love Jimmy G, I'm not going to sit here and argue that like the defense is out there playing better because they've got Jimmy G who's got their back, and they've got Kyle Shanahan. Maybe that actually has an impact, right? Jimmy G and Kyle Shanahan have their back. But that is where it gets dicey. And you look at Kirk Cousins, you look at Jimmy G. To me, that's way more analogous to what the decision is with Dak. And to say like, okay, is that the guy that I am willing to pay this amount of money? Because now you've narrowed the margin of that you have. You cannot have these missteps. You cannot overpay players that don't have a big impact on winning if you have one of those guys, because they're just simply not going to produce as many wins above replacement as those truly elite guys. So, I mean, as we wait for Jason to hop on here, right now, you have to pay a Dak, a Kirk Cousins, a Jimmy G, and pay them like a top 10 guy or a top, 6, 7 guy. Would you do it?
Yes. Here's why. There's enough players on rookie deals on that offense, and there's enough, I think, of a understanding by Mike McCarthy. Like, him saying that they have to win by scoring 35 points a game was like the best quote of the entire offseason, in my estimation. I looked at, when I was looking at this, looking at WAR, but I also looked at WAR coach plus quarterback, and Dak's WAR, when you incorporated Garrett's decision-making, went down like half a win, and he was still the most efficient player in terms of turning APY into WAR last year. There's a big unknown that's associated. I think that the positive outcome that the unknown of Mike McCarthy and Kellen Moore and CeeDee Lamb brings to that team outweighs the negative of having to like tear it down and start over at quarterback.
So I agree with you. And here's what I'd say. Jason's coming on now. This is about maximizing your opportunity to win football games and possibly win Super Bowls. And you can still it's easier to be smart in those other situations than it is to hit on another quarterback, right? Once you have a guy that can get you a top 10 performance and your offense can be top, 6, 7 in a year if you combine the coach, it's easier to make smart decisions elsewhere than it is to go out and hit on a quarterback again that can get you to that level. Jason, brother, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you, George.
How's it going, man?
Pretty good.
You are a Jets fan, and you're in New York, so I got to start by asking you: are you safe and healthy, and how's everything going over there?
Yeah, we're good. We're our family is actually on the Jersey side, so we're
all the same.
So we're on a little bit on the outside of where everything has gotten really bad in the that Bergen-Hudson County area.
Yeah, it's scary stuff, man. I'm here in DC, and this is actually really interesting. This morning, my girlfriend asked if I would be amenable to going wine tasting this weekend, and I almost fainted. I was like, "What are you talking about?" Apparently, there are places that are opening up outside with these 6-foot, radii tables or whatever.
Yep.
And you can order ahead and you pick it up and it's contactless and all of this stuff. And I got to say,
would you be wearing one of those those inner tubes
bubbles?
That's the 3 feet on each side?
Look, I love wine, and I wanted to open up having Jason on here by talking a little bit about alcoholic beverages because he is an aficionado himself. I love wine. As much as I would love to drink it in 80-degree weather outside, I am hesitant to risk it, man.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I'd be the same way, and I'm sure we'll have those discussions coming up in New Jersey pretty soon too. We're still pretty much completely locked down here, but they're starting to lighten up the regulations a little bit.
I was listening to a couple of your podcasts, and if you are listening and you haven't checked out Jason or OverTheCap.com or those podcasts that you have, you certainly should, because if you want to know anything about the way the salary cap works, that's the number one place to go to. And you opened up one of your podcasts talking about some beer, and that's one of the ways that we like whenever we have someone come on the podcast. I like to ask you, what is your drink of choice? So I'm guessing you're going to give me a very snobby beer response, but I'm going to ask anyways. What's your drink of choice?
Well, pretty much my fallback beer, and most people who listen to the podcast will know it. The Dogfish Head 60-minute IPA is pretty much always going to be my fallback. The Southern Tier 2X is really good. I also like Southern Tier's Christmas Ale, if I can usually find that one. And obviously there's a bunch of different IPAs out there that are pretty good that I like, but the Dogfish Head is the fallback one for me, pretty much all the time.
You mentioned a beer
George
that
doesn't
I actually
drink beer,
know.
so he has to know that that's a good choice, and I will tell him that as somebody who drinks beer.
No, it's funny. When I was expecting you to say the name of a beer that I just was going to have no clue about, I was kind of thinking that you might say Monkish because that's a popular one that I've heard and our buddy Rick Drummond drinks. But Dogfish Head, I actually knew that the logo there, it's like a shark, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
So there you go. I don't feel like a complete
You're a man of the
idiot
people,
now.
George.
And by the way, I do drink beer, but I will only drink really good beer, and it's usually if it's with a Mexican or a barbecue meal. That's kind of my go-to, which I think is a fair.
Yeah.
It's a good accompaniment. Jason, so for people that don't kind of know the Over the Cap story, give us kind of a short rundown, a little summary of it, and how you in your life is. You do a couple of different things, spin a couple of different plates, including being a Jets fan while doing salary cap analysis.
Yeah, so really it's being a Jets fan, I think, that led to doing the salary cap analysis originally. There was so much talk about salary cap issues as it pertained in particular to the New York Jets. I kind of like talking about that, on message forums back at that point in time. Every team had a quote unquote cap guy that would talk a little bit about contracts. And I was one of the people that did that for the Jets. There were plenty of other people that did that too. And just kind of figured, what if I took this to the next level and really tried to break contracts down in a way that was very different than anyone else did? So we started to build these interactive tables that could show you salary cap numbers, dead cap numbers if the players were going to be released. And more so than that, we kind of wrote about it, or I wrote about it back then, where you would really just talk about contract issues. And no one was really doing that at the time. And that started to catch the eye of a lot of sports agents, and it caught the eye of teams as well, just because it was a very different way to analyze stuff. And so over time, I decided I would kind of branch that out, see if we could expand that to 32 NFL teams. And that's when I launched Over the Cap. And it was way more successful than I ever thought that it would be, just in terms of the stuff that we do. And I think it's really kind of raised the level on the discussion when it comes to the contract side of things that really wasn't there 7, 8, 9 years ago, whether that's from people reading the website or that is from reporters who have just had to up their game because there's more knowledge amongst fans now because of people like myself or Joel Corey, who writes for CBS Sports. And that's pretty much what we do. I mean, we talk about the salary cap. We educate about the salary cap. We have a lot of numbers there about contracts, whatever we can find, whatever we can piece together on contract numbers. On the back end side, we do consulting, both on the team end and more so on the agent end, just for building different things and different kind of tools and different ways to analyze things and looking at teams in the future and in the present, and just trying to educate a little bit more and get people to, kind of engage with this aspect of the NFL, the way that they're kind of gauging as well with the analytics side and how you can kind of merge some of those things together, which is kind of probably the next generation of where football, I would think, is going to be headed.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up such a good point about the fact, it was amusing once when we were watching the, I think it was the free agency, right, George? And last season when the NFL Network, which, in theory has access to all this information, was citing Over the Cap for most of the contract information. And it is amazing where, the conversation has gone. We've it's exactly as you said. The average football fan just knows so much more than they did 10 years ago. And I think you guys are such a one of the biggest reasons why. And it's great. And it we're leading to more, I think leading to more efficiency, but then at the same time leading to more innovation, because teams have to start doing things differently if they want to have an edge.
Well,
yeah, absolutely.
You said like the analytics side of things, and you're spot on. People are inherently scared of when you bring a bunch of numbers into things, and it's one of the questions that I kind of have with both analytics and the salary cap. And I'm curious what your answer to this question would be. Is it made, and you can probably hear the sirens here. I'm on 16th Street, which just happens to be a hotbed of activity, a couple blocks from the White House. So bear with me here. But would you say that salary cap analysis, or maybe the way that contracts are reported, or the way that maybe teams talk about them, is needlessly complex, and that drives people away from wanting to engage with it?
I think so. Definitely in the past, that was absolutely the case. If you go back to the 2000s, when people would talk about the salary cap, they thought you had to be, Albert Einstein to understand it. They thought you had to be a wizard with numbers to somehow figure out these rules. And the rules were a little bit more complex then, but for the most part, it's really just an accounting system. So if you can do enough math to do accounting, you can pretty much figure out the math of a salary cap. So that part really isn't too difficult, but I do think there's a tendency for both agents and teams to make it sound really, really, really complicated. And I think a lot of times then when bigger media people talk about it, they really make it sound complex to make it sound like it was just all these crazy factors that went into getting a deal done. And most of the time it's not as nearly as complicated as the way that it's made out to be.
What if you were talking? So say, someone came in and said, "Look, I know nothing about it. Give me like the 3 things that I should always pay attention to," or maybe it's just 2. What are the things that you look at first? That you say, "Look, these are the huge, major tenets of any contract or any salary cap negotiation"?
So for me, the first thing that I would look at, and this has changed over the years, but really, I just look at the cash components of the NFL contract as they come in.
Mm-hmm.
Cash is king in the NFL. The way that cash breaks down is really what's going to drive if you've got a bargain on the deal or if you don't have a bargain on the contract, really what the effective length of that contract is going to be, what kind of dead money that you're looking at carrying for the player if the player doesn't live up to the deal and you have to release him. To me, that's the most important thing to look at, is the way the cash breaks down year by year, not just overall, what's the cash looking like in year 1? Then what's it look like in year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5? The second thing that I'll usually look at is a signing bonus that's attributed to the contract, or any kind of prorated money in the event that a team also uses some other bonuses that spread out over the deal. That gives you an idea as to how they're trying to kind of manipulate the numbers, and what the cost of that could be in the future if the players don't work out. And then the third thing, just because people like to talk about it, and obviously it's what drives the year-by-year decisions, is those salary cap numbers themselves, just kind of how they fluctuate in there. And that's probably the third thing that I look at. And I think if you can combine those 3 things, as well as some other factors where you start looking into players' age and positions that they play, you can start to get an idea of how many years that player is probably going to actually be on that contract
Right.
for. The minute they sign it, everyone signs these big 5-year deals. Majority of players are gone after the 3rd year. Many of them don't even make it to the 3rd year. And you can start to get an idea for that just based on the way the contracts are designed.
Well, it brings it up where I think, the cool thing about football, but, when you talk about like looking at the analytics, like, you break it down by subsets of things, and and how a guy does in this scheme might be different than how a guy does in that scheme. And that's what makes the salary cap analysis so interesting as well, because as you said, a contract isn't just APY. A contract isn't just, cash flows per year or, cap number, right? It's how the puzzle pieces fit together. And that's a multidimensional problem that I think, like, that's where I think people get, the idea that it's extremely complicated, because, you might be trying to fit, this guy in on sort of a backloaded deal, and this guy in on a front loaded, all that kind of stuff. And it's not as simple as just like taking the 2 cap hits in 1 year and dividing by whatever. It's truly a problem that requires a decent amount of, understanding of, how a team's approaching things, even if the assumption that they're approaching things logically isn't true.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot that goes into it. And I think the other thing that does confuse people where you bring that up, there's 32 different teams. And of those 32 different teams, you get a lot of different approaches to the way that they handle the salary cap. Teams have different tendencies. Teams have different things they do. you have to know that when you negotiate with the team. You have to know that when you're analyzing the team's salary cap structure. If a team doesn't go into free agency very often, the Packers do now, but the Packers didn't for many years. The Pittsburgh Steelers usually don't sign too many players in free agency. They don't need to have millions and millions and millions of cap space every year because they're not going to use it on those players. They just have to make sure that their cap can adjust for the extensions that are going to come up for the players that they have. So it's almost like a case-by-case basis based on where the roster is at that specific point in time. How you view it. It's not one size fits all, and a lot of people think it's a one size fits all equation, and it's really not.
Yeah, it was so funny. Like you look at like Tampa Bay, for example, doesn't give out signing bonuses, right? And it's just like, when you negotiate with them, like it's like probably a non-starter for almost all players. Yeah.
Yeah, you just don't even go in there and ask for it. Same thing with San Francisco. San Francisco does things where everyone has to have per game bonuses. Everyone has to have workout money. And they don't do guarantees that vest until April 1st of the following year. And so those are all just non-starters. You don't go in there and say, well, I want my guy's salary to guarantee in February. You just say, we don't do that. And that's the end of the discussion.
This is a great question. So who would you say, and I think I'm asking this because I'm a San Francisco 49ers fan. And I'm hoping this is your answer. But who's the best contract negotiating team in the NFL?
I think the three best teams right now are the 49ers, the Philadelphia Eagles, and the Minnesota Vikings. In some order that's there. I'd probably lean towards San Francisco as being the best. Correct. In terms of how they do their contracts, the way that they kind of plan overall with them, the way that they structure the deals. It's very team friendly. Philadelphia, I think, maybe has a better overall front office, a better overall grand scheme of things picture. But just on a pure contract basis, San Francisco is probably the team. And yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, unpack that a little bit for, some people who don't understand what you mean by that. And maybe Jimmy G's contract was obviously one that is been talked about a lot and is coming up again because of Dak. What are some of the things that they do that are different that really make their contract structure smart?
So one of the things that you just mentioned with Garoppolo there, there's different ways, where Eric was talking about the way that the teams can structure the deals and how backloaded, front loaded. And sometimes you have to kind of get those cap hits to go with your expectations, maybe for a team. Mm-hmm. And I think with Garoppolo in particular, they realized we've got to overpay to keep the quarterback. Garoppolo had 5 starts, 7 starts, whatever the number was when they made him the highest paid player in the NFL. He held that distinction for probably about a week, but he had that distinction. So they said, well, what's the best way to handle this? Let's take a $37 million cap charge in the first year. We have cap space. We're probably not competing for a championship this year. If we get $37 million out of the way, that'll bring his average over the next couple of years probably down to, say, $24 million. We can be more competitive that way. The other thing that they do is the way that the contracts are structured there's always kind of late decision points for them. So they can watch free agency unfold and they can sign a better player, or they can watch all the money around the league dry up and they can go to a player on the roster and either cut them or tell them, look, if you don't take a pay cut and, we're going to gain more cap space and we're going to gain more on our budget with that, we're just going to cut you. Mm-hmm. And because we're already talking about April, teams have already used up their budget around the NFL. So the players kind of end up backed into a corner to where if they're going to remain on the deal, they pretty much have to take it. They have to take that pay cut. And it's just a really great way that they do it.
Yeah, the Garoppolo deal it's almost, when they signed it, I was really excited by it for the reasons that you just mentioned. But I think there's a lot of hesitancy. It's like, well, I don't want to be the team that's paying a guy $37 million this year. It's like, who cares about that? You got to care about the things that really matter. And if you can pay a quarterback an average of 24 per year, and Eric and I were just having this conversation, like maybe you slightly overpay, market value wise, but you're slightly overpaying based on the market, but you're underpaying based on what you're getting in return because the quarterback is so valuable, and you just have to make smart decisions elsewhere.
Yeah.
And that's the part that, I think some teams do mess up, but it's such a smart strategy, especially if you can execute it.
I mean, the tricky thing is deciding whether or not the quarterback became worthy of you paying a lot of money to, based upon things that are lucky. And because the issue is that, you're just going to be, when you buy into a quarterback, you're going to be short stacked the rest of your poker game, right? And if you don't have means to get, quote, lucky again, like say Dallas, if Michael Gallup and CeeDee Lamb stink, right, and the offensive lineman that they bring in to replace, Travis Frederick to be, and the if Trayvon Diggs stinks in Byron Jones's stead, like, it's going to make everybody's going to shine a light on Dak and say, hey, your contract is the reason we suck. And when it's probably not fair, and it probably wasn't fair for Dak to get as much credit as he got on the rookie deal, because they were able to surround him with talent and high price talents on the roster. But that's kind of the calculus, right? And to San Francisco's credit, with Garoppolo, when he got hurt, that was okay. Let's go 4-12, get the second overall pick, get a great value with Nick Bosa, and now he's a reasonable charge. And they hit on Deebo Samuel, they hit on George Kittle, all of them relatively cheap. And that's really where, like, if you're going to pay a quarterback top dollar, you need you need the effects downstream to be a value and a plus value.
Yeah, the other thing too is you have to understand the timing of it. Contracts are always moving, contracts are always changing. Years ago when Eli Manning became the highest paid player in the NFL at 16 million, 16.5 million, to show how far things have gone in the last 10 years or so. Within 3 years, you can argue the effectiveness of an Eli Manning. But within 3 years, the big contracts that were signed by him, Rivers, and Roethlisberger looked like bargains. They signed 6-year deals at $16 million, and in the blink of an eye, it was $20 million a season. One of the reasons I'm sure San Francisco did the deal when they did it with Garoppolo was the worry that Kirk Cousins, I think, was going to hit free agency that year. So you just worry about how might things change. The Eagles with Carson Wentz, the Rams with Jared Goff. One of the reasons they probably did those deals when they did, the fear of what's going to happen with Dallas and Dak Prescott. If a later round pick who has really had no playoff success gets $35 million a year, well, now we're going to have to pay 37 for our guys who are the number 1 or number 2 pick, have gotten teams to a Super Bowl, even if they haven't necessarily been that successful. Other than that, and that changes things. So at that point, it's like, why haggle over $1 million a year? Just sign him for 32, 33 million, get it out of the way. We're not going to worry about it as much 2-3 years from now. And that's one of the things where Dallas probably missed the boat a little bit by not getting Prescott done earlier, just because they probably could have gotten him done at the same time Wentz and those guys got finished, and that they probably would have had an easier time, I think, getting him at that $31 million number, which is probably what they wanted.
What do you think? So if we look at Dak and what might happen, is looking at the Garoppolo contract a reasonable way to think about how Dallas might try and attack Dak, or is it going to be too hard because Dak has made a claim that, hey, I'm better than that, and I deserve a little more respect than that?
I think the market has changed enough to where they probably won't be able to do anything that way. I think he would also be able to lean on the fact that he has more years of experience actually playing than Garoppolo did at the time. The closest comparable I would say that he's going to be bringing up is Kirk Cousins, and Cousins' contract right now is, I think, $33 a year. It's a short-term extension, so maybe they view that as like a 5-year deal going back to his original contract. That makes it about $30 million a season. I'm sure they're going to look at this and say Prescott's had more success than Kirk Cousins, but a little bit of a higher-powered offense there in Dallas. He came out of Washington, not really having done much. They're basically 7-9 kind of team most seasons, and so at the very least, he needs to be worth more than that. So I think that's probably more along the lines of what they're looking at as kind of a comparable that's there. And then it's up to Dallas, I think, as to how they structure that deal. If I was Dallas, I would probably look at the Garoppolo deal as a good way to structure it. I think with players like Prescott, you want to have the maximum flexibility possible to where if 2 years down the line he doesn't take that next step that you're hoping he takes, that you can walk away from him. Dallas hasn't really done anything to kind of stack the cupboard behind him to kind of get a look at other quarterbacks that might be able to be effective in their system. But maybe next year is the time to start doing that, and you start kind of, I don't know, kind of mitigating that risk a little bit of the big deal by, getting someone behind him that can maybe jump in there 2 years from now, 3 years from now.
Well, and they also have, they've invested in a lot of other players, and this is where I would say, look, the problem is not haggling Dak Prescott over a few million or even a year, which I know is one of the things that Dak, he doesn't want that fifth year. Where you could have really saved yourself is not over investing in some of these ancillary pieces, like an Ezekiel Elliott, for example, who
Jalen Smith.
Jalen Smith. DeMarcus Lawrence is making an absolute ton of money. And I look at Lawrence, I look at Frank Clark, and you say, look, you're paying these guys, 2/3 of what you're paying some of the top quarterbacks in the league. You're not getting 2/3 of the value that you're getting from those top quarterbacks. So it's going to be interesting. Do you think the years is ultimately the sticking point between the two of them right now?
It might be. There have been players who've had these 4-year contracts for some period of time. We kind of talk about it as a new thing, but in part, it's really only new because of the Wentz and Goff contracts. Russell Wilson has had 2 4-year deals now. That's just the Seattle Seahawks thing. The Ryan Tannehills of the world getting a 4-year deal. The kind of plus 30 category quarterbacks have kind of always been in that area anyway. So that it's probably a minor part of it, but I think the bigger part of it is they're kind of looking for him to be the highest paid player in the NFL. And Dallas probably has a hesitancy to do that. It's kind of strange the way things work in the NFL. It was different long time ago, not so much now. A lot of teams are kind of afraid to be the first. But once somebody does it, then teams have no problems, jumping past it. It's like Todd Gurley and the Rams for years. Running backs couldn't get a contract. The Rams were relatively respectable front office. They say, okay, we'll do the contract for our running back. Next thing you know, David Johnson's got a big contract. Le'Veon Bell's got a big contract. Ezekiel Elliott, Christian McCaffrey. And it's like everyone has just thrown out 10 years of data and kind of pushing down on these running back contracts because one team did it. It's like, all right, they did it. We can do it too. So I think sometimes that comes into play, and it's very hard to make a case that Prescott, I think, is better than Russell Wilson, who right now is the top paid guy. So I think it's hard for them to probably justify in their heads jumping over Wilson in a reasonable contract offer.
It's hard for me to justify that in my head too. What about Eric's guy? Are you wearing a Chiefs shirt right now? I can never tell. I can see that's red. I don't know if it's actually.
No, it's a San Antonio Commanders of the AAF, which I know Jason's a big fan of the spring leagues as well. So I figured we would.
I'm happy that there's this rumor, at least, that the XFL could be coming back in some way, shape, or form. Dirty business if that's the way that it happened. But I'll be happy for more spring football.
I saw your tweet. It's like how shady, it's like, I hope it's not true for the morals of it, but I hope it's true because I want to see spring football, although we might get spring college football next year. Who knows?
Yeah, that's true.
As football fans, I think we're put in that moral dilemma like every day, right? With what we're rooting for. But Mahomes is interesting. And I've heard a lot of people posit a ton of different theories on this. What are some of the dominoes that need to fall for Mahomes, and what do you think ultimately gets done there in Kansas City?
I think that'll be a 4-year kind of contract. I think that they will probably look to hit that $40 million a year mark. I don't know how much pushback Kansas City is going to give on that. I wouldn't think too much. He's top quarterback in the NFL. There's probably a pretty big gap between him and the next closest person. You don't want to go in there with almost any quarterback, but certainly a player like that. There's really no need to fight over those numbers unless they're just asking for something that's, so crazy. $50 million a year would be crazy. But if they're looking for something that's a $5 million a year increase over Wilson, I don't really see what the hang up would be in doing something like that. Might it be a
when
little
was
bit
the
less?
last that is so you wrote a really good article looking at this. What would that be comparable to? Like, how often do we see that kind of a jump happen?
Gosh, I'm trying to think back. Andrew Luck jumped by about 2.5, I think, per year over Aaron Rodgers. Rodgers was the guy that really capped things off. Rodgers took that deal at 22.5 years ago, and he was basically considered the man at that point in time. And every team in the NFL said, "You're not going to earn more than Aaron Rodgers. This guy is in his prime. He's so good. There's no case that you can make to earn more than him." But Andrew Luck was a 2.5. Matt Stafford was probably 2 million over Carr, maybe even 3 million over him. And then I'm trying to think the next jump up. I don't remember, it was Matt Ryan. That could have been up to 30. But there's been a couple of players that, basically about 2-3 million a year. But Mahomes is such a special player. Again, if it's going to cost you an extra 2 million a season, you're not gonna haggle over that. It's just, you're not doing anything to help your team by doing that. If you're really worried about saving money, save your 17 million or whatever it's going to cost to keep Chris Jones this year on a franchise tag. That there's other ways that they could have saved money if that was really the concern, that they need to come up with a couple extra $1 million per year over the next few seasons.
Your boy Frank Clark, Eric. I mean, that's the thing, is we worry about.
We won a Super Bowl, so all is forgiven.
Exactly, and that's the tough thing too. Is you're sometimes, and this is what it's interesting. You didn't mention Bill Belichick and the Patriots earlier when we were talking, and I'm curious your thoughts on how they handle things. One of the things that I always hear that makes a ton of sense is they do not pay for past performance. Now, with Patrick Mahomes, right, there's no reason to believe that his future performance won't be exceptional and worth $40 million a year. But there is this, okay, we won a Super Bowl. You were a part of a Super Bowl winning team. Like, I'm going to pay you a little extra something because of that past performance, which in general is one of those ways that I was just talking about, where you end up spending money on things that are worth absolutely nothing. And I feel like that probably happens way too much outside of New England.
Different organization as well. They're a little bit harder to judge, I think, with their salary cap, only because it's pretty rare that they go in there and they sign, a lot of big name guys. Gilmore was like an exception where they jumped in there and they gave him the deal that they did. And, they used a pretty smart strategy with him. They guaranteed him a lot of money, gave him a favorable contract structure, and they actually kept his annual value down by doing that. But for the most part, they live in that sub $5 million per year category. They go and find a bunch of guys and say, look, you're getting a little bit older. This is a great opportunity for you to come in and play with New England, have a chance to finally win that Super Bowl. You've made your money elsewhere. Come back and play with us. How many times do they let a player like a Jamie Collins go and then bring him back? You rarely see that in the NFL. They bring him back for $10 million less than the Cleveland Browns paid him.
Yeah.
And then they said, okay, go walk to Detroit and let Detroit pay you $10 million more because that's not worth it for us. So they go and they find all these guys who were, former kind of first round, second round picks that aren't bad, but didn't live up to kind of a first round status. They kind of get them at an affordable price on a short-term deal. They go and find, older veterans in the past, your Chris Long types that are really looking to win more than make money. They've made it. And you go in there, the old Pat Riley thing. You go in there with a bunch of rings, you lay them out on the table and say, you can take this contract and you can get one of these, or you can go somewhere else for a couple million more. And, that's it. You'll be home in January.
The fact that we were able to get Pat Riley and his ring negotiation tactic in this makes it one of the best podcasts we've had already. That guy is an absolute legend. So Mahomes, if let's say he goes, it's 4 years, 40 a year, basically. When we 4 years from now are sitting here, is that still going to be the marker, or at that point are we saying, wow, What a deal. 40 for Patrick Mahomes. What do you think?
Of these guys pan out that are young right now, the Baker Mayfield class, and obviously Lamar Jackson looks like the guy from that group right now. Depending on how those guys kind of pan out, you'll see how quickly that could turn into a bargain. My guess is he's so good that'll probably cap the market, but there's not going to be this disparity. I think it'll be the same as the Aaron Rodgers time that I was talking about before, where you'll basically have a whole bunch of guys that creep up to, say, $38 million a year, $37 million a year. And if you have Patrick Mahomes at $40 million and for some reason, Josh Allen or Sam Darnold is making $35 or $37 million a year, that's a great bargain for Kansas City. They're never going to look at that with regret. As long as he doesn't get injured, you can't control that. That's the one thing completely out of your control. If somebody is going to get hurt, there's just nothing you can do about that. But I think the contracts will move close enough to that to where you probably still look at that as a bargain. He'd have to be so far above market right now to where people wouldn't even touch him. And that just doesn't happen anymore in the NFL, or very rarely.
And what about the impact? I mean, obviously we've got the pandemic right now, but you've got the TV deals coming up. Like, if you're prognosticating, what do you think is happening to the cap over the next few years?
You would think it would go down. The way the rules are written, basically they set the salary cap based on estimates every year. And so your estimates that would have come in for this year was really before this was even considered to be anything more than maybe a minor issue. Certainly was not going to be something that was going to lead into the actual NFL season. Now where you're talking about playing in empty stadiums and you start getting into adjustments where you start having revised estimates and then your actual numbers that come in, next January and the following March. The way the rules are written is you're supposed to have a adjustment the following year that kind of makes up for that. There's a lot of teams worried about what that could be. In general, I think the sides would get in there and negotiate and say, okay, if we're going to take a $90 million loss, instead of having it hit the cap in 1 year, let's 30 this year, 30 the following year, 30 the year after that. And I kind of think that's probably what will happen. But I would think all this talk about these, large jumps in the salary cap, I think that's pretty much going to go by the wayside at this point. Yeah. And even with the TV contracts, who knows what the long lasting impacts are going to be on the economy. If the advertising revenues go way, way, way down, I don't know if the television networks can justify, the kind of increases that people were talking about before. Because as it is, the NFL is pretty much a vehicle for them to, get eyeballs on their other products. They're pretty much not making money on the NFL. But if they can't, if they can't bring in the revenues from those other programs to, from the advertisers or the advertisers that hit the Super Bowl and all that, I don't know if they can do the kind of increases that the NFL was planning on either.
Yeah, that's such an interesting thought, and I do think you're right. I mean, I don't know if they just rip the Band-Aid off for 1 year and then reevaluate. I think that would have labor implications that I don't think the league is ready for. We've already had, a number of, discussions about, what 2011 meant to offensive line play, for example, and, having a season where, a significant number of veterans are out of work because, the teams can't pay them. I can't see that being, a positive for the league.
Well, I'd almost think that there would be a bailout, right? Like before you would cut that type of money from it because of how important the NFL is. And this is one of the things I was thinking about because you brought the ad revenue, and so if there's one place that advertisers are going to want to advertise, it's going to be live NFL games, right? Because this is the thing that people are craving for. And I wonder if it's just that everything else suffers dramatically, but everyone comes to the NFL and says, okay, well, this is the one place we've got to get our name out there because this is our chance to reach this enormous group of people with some buying power. And it has a downstream effect, but the NFL is largely unhurt because of how powerful they are.
I think their viewership would be unhurt. I think I guess the question that I would have is, depending on the way things go with the economy, unemployment rates, and, kind of an oddball thing to be talking about on a football podcast here, but
it matters.
Are people going to have that kind of disposable income to spend over the next 2-3 years? I don't know if that's going to be the case. If people are really hurting, and obviously people are using up a lot of savings right now to try and get through this. How many jobs are going to be gone after this? That's probably going to impact a lot of what people can actually go out there and spend. So if the market isn't there for people to be spending money, I'm not sure if the advertisers are going to go crazy. They're certainly going to advertise in the programs. I just don't know if they're going to pay the kind of money that would give those huge increases in revenue that they were expecting before.
It's a great point, and it's something that it's something that we get into this rut of always believing things will go up, but that's not always the case.
Jason, I want to get you out here on some quick hitters. So I've got a few here. The first is, everyone's talking about Dak and Mahomes incessantly. What's a contract storyline that is flying under the radar that we should be talking more about?
Talking about here, if teams don't get any kind of direction as to what the salary cap is going to be next year, they're going to have to start planning for that in August. And the way that you start doing that are those veterans who probably kind of questionable performers. You would say, you know what, we're willing to keep them for $7 million this year. They'll probably give us a little bit better chance than the unknown rookie that's coming in. If you're looking at a decrease in revenues, a significant decrease in revenues, and you're not going to be bringing the money in to pay those players, and you're also planning for salary cap next year, and you want to maximize your carryover, you may see a lot of those veterans hit the street just because they make so much money. And I think most people are just looking at 2021 as saying, all right, well, who's going to be the big purge of the roster in 2021? From a planning perspective, that needs to start in August, and it needs to start right at the beginning of camp, because you don't want guys getting hurt in camp to where you're obligated to pay them for the season. You may just start cutting ties on players that are kind of questionable on the roster who are veterans.
That's such a great point. I'm thinking also, if they have to expand rosters for the pandemic, let's say they make an exemption this year and their rosters are 60 players deep just to deal with those possibilities. The higher price veterans, I think the marginal value of them is going to go down. Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely. The more bodies and stuff that you can have there, that's going to drive that down. And, on top of that, if you expand rosters, that's also expanding the amount of money that you're paying for those players. It's a practice squad player makes around $150,000 a year, $600,000 a year to keep just a rookie on the team. An undrafted rookie is $600,000. So yeah, that would also have big impacts overall on teams. Even with the CBA, where they increase the salaries by $100,000 or $90,000, the minimums, depending on where you were. I know there were a couple of teams that generally would be considered the lower spending teams in the NFL. The Indianapolis Colts, the Houston Texans, where just that increase alone, they said, that really hurts us with budgeting process, because now we have an extra $3 million we're going to be paying to players that, we didn't think we were going to have to pay to them before.
Okay. And then last one, the best contract and the worst contract right now in the NFL.
Oh gosh, that's a tough one. Best contract in the NFL is, oh boy, who would be the best contract? Man, that is a really tough one. It's probably the Richard Sherman deal.
Oh.
They did a deal with him that I thought was real. They really took advantage of him at the time when they did that. He was given no upside in that contract at all. This from a team perspective, obviously. He was really given very limited upside. He did reach a bunch of those incentives this year. To reach them, he basically had to play out of his mind. If he had taken the type of contract that most would have expected, which would have been a 1-year kind of prove-it deal, he would have gone back in the market and probably been making $14, $15 million a year instead of playing at 9 or 10 right now. As for the worst deal, Now that Joe Flacco is gone, I can't fall back on that one. Joe Flacco was always the fallback for many, many, many years. San Francisco had a disaster of a contract as well with McKinnon.
Yep.
The Rams
we got to have some running backs in here at some point.
Yeah, well, a lot of those guys have been cut. The Rams with Gurley and those were all kind of questionable deals when they got signed. David Johnson's deal is probably the worst in the NFL still. He's moved teams now, but the contract still remains.
And somehow the Texans valued him with that contract.
Oh, that's one of the worst trades I've ever seen. It made no sense at all. It's like if you wanted to shed salary for DeAndre Hopkins, you didn't think you were going to re-sign him, and it was just going to create a bad locker room situation. Okay, fine. You trade him, bring back a second round pick, whatever it is. Yeah. Why would you bring back, $12, $13 million in salary for another running back? It made no sense at all.
I honestly,
no sense.
I said this. I was like, if you were trying to trade me Todd Gurley, Leonard Fournette, David Johnson, I would say, okay, are you giving me a first as well? Like, what am I getting to take on this massive ball and chain that you're shipping over to me? Like, this is a burden. I don't want this.
Well, when that deal came down, that was my thought. I said, okay, you know what? I said the Cardinals either picked up all the salary for David Johnson, so they're just taking a flyer on a player who's cheap, or they're going to give them like a first round and a third round pick, because they're taking him off your hands. Plus they're getting DeAndre Hopkins. And instead it just wasn't that at all. It was just an awful, awful, awful trade.
Apparently this is breaking right now per our friend at NBC, Chris Sims, that the Cowboys offered Dak a 5-year, $175 million deal, pays him $35 million annually, make him the highest paid quarterback ever. And Dak reportedly wants north of 45 in that last year. What's your reaction to that?
I think Dallas would do that. I mean, if you're talking about 45 in that last year, that means the annual value over the 4-year deal, the 4 years of it, which is really the meat of the contract, is actually going to be lower. That last year, if he's good, you're going to extend him anyway. If he stinks, you're going to cut him. So you don't really care about that. So I would think if that's accurate, I would think that Dallas would probably do that deal in a heartbeat, because a player should be looking at it in the opposite direction. They should be looking to get as much up front as possible, not throw money in the back end to do that. I mean, it gives you a little protection with the franchise tag, just based on the way rules go, if he was to be franchised again. But that's kind of surprising. I would think Dallas would take that if that was a counter. I would think Dallas would probably take something like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought the same thing, which is I would just be wanting more early, but that's what it is, and we'll see where this thing goes. Jason, this was awesome. I had a blast. We'll have to have you on here again. In the meantime, anyone out there that's listening that does not use OverTheCap.com, you're missing out. You can also follow Jason. It's at JasonOTC. Is that right?
_OTC. Yep.
_OTC.
Yeah, they'll figure it out.
And your podcasts are great. You've been going deep dives on teams, which have been awesome. OverTheCap.com. We use it at PFF for all the contract stuff. It's fantastic. You can have a blast there. You got nothing to do, so you might as well learn something about the Cap and your team. Jason, enjoy the fine beers, my man, and stay healthy.
I will try and do that. All right, guys, you be well.
Thanks.
Take care, Jason.
Jason Fitzgerald from Over the Cap, man, is awesome. He's been to Cincy. He's visited us. We took him out to dinner, had a blast, talked about the Jets a lot. Poor guy. I didn't want to burden him by talking about the Jets too much there.
They do a great thing where at Tulane Law School every January they have a competition where you have a team side and an agent side, and you get these upcoming lawyers haggling over deals, and Jason's one of the architects of that, which is pretty awesome. And just the inroads that he's made. I think it's important, like, just to point out that where we were discussing football 10 years ago, and obviously PFF's a big part of that, but OTC and things like that, I think the average football fan is just so much smarter as a result.
No, it's that's a great point. And he is what's cool about, Jason, what Jason did with OTC is similar to PFF story too, which I think is cool. Real quick, I want to talk about the match here at the end. Do you have any big takeaway from what Jason said?
No, I think he makes a lot of sense about the quarter. It's always so funny when the thing was, what's an increase in APY for the next best quarterback, and you said like $2.5 million.
Yep.
That doesn't seem like that much, but from a team commitment standpoint, it's not trivial at all. And the funniest thing at the end was it's really easy to find bad contracts. It's hard to find really good contracts, and that might be always something that a team might want to take with them as they sort of build their squad.
I'm letting people know that we were talking to Jason about the Dak thing and retweeting that. So go listen to it. People that aren't listening right now, that was stupid. The match. What are your thoughts here? Give me you don't play a lot of golf. These guys as football players, Brady and Manning. Manning and Woods are pretty heavy favorites. Last I checked, they were minus 200, and Mickelson and Brady were about plus 185.
Mickelson beat Woods, right, one-on-one?
In the match, the prior match, which was just them, yeah.
And that he was like basically the same underdog. Maybe he was more like 140.
Mm-hmm.
What was he? Yeah.
Yeah, it was closer.
I mean, I think the only bet you can make is the dog here, right?
I am right there with you. The idea that Manning and Woods are that heavy of a favorite is ridiculous to me. Now, the one thing is that it's at Tiger's home course. And I've heard stories that Tiger has shot, like he just destroys practice rounds on this course. I believe he designed it as well. I might be wrong there. So like that's the one kicker. But I'll get back to this. It's going to be a casual environment. You talked about Tiger's killer mentality. In a casual environment where there's fun, there's gambling, there's going to be IFBs in their ear so that the producer can talk to the players and they can hear the announcers. To me, that sounds like what Phil Mickelson does every day. So I will take the underdog. I also enjoy rooting for Brady against Manning. So that's what I'm going to do.
Peyton Manning, who we once shared dinner like 5 feet from.
That was an incredible moment.
I didn't know who he was because there was somebody you were like, look who that is. I'm like, somebody's like big head was in his way or something. So, but yeah, Peyton, an absolute boss coming in through the back door, is sitting down in the corner. That was a great place. We saw Tua there as well, and he ended up, that was where he ended up getting drafted. So
I still want to know. So I think we told this story, but we were at Joe's Famous Crab or whatever in Miami, and Peyton is there in the corner with his wife, and being kind of blocked off. A great table, and I really want to know who the person was. One person came in, a guy came in and joined them, and Manning and his wife, Peyton and his wife, were done. And I don't know her name. That's the reason I'm not mentioning it. We're done eating. And this guy ordered. And they sat there and talked to this guy while he ate his whole meal. And I want to know who this guy is because he got Peyton Manning to just sit there and watch him eat.
Yeah, it'd be like if, Chris and his wife were sitting there and they were done and we came over and just
another hour and a half. No big deal.
Let's be honest. This person must have been important to Peyton because I would not even try to do that with somebody like,
I don't know if it was his agent, maybe.
Could have been.
I don't know.
What is man? I guess Manning still has so much going on that his agent has still got to be busy.
Oh yeah, the commercials, the detail stuff, people trying to get him to sign TV contracts. Absolutely. I think that's all we've got for today. Great podcast. Thanks to Jason Fitzgerald. We'll be back on Monday. Stay healthy. Thanks for tuning in. Peace out, guys.